Bonjour tout le monde. C'est la première fois que je fais une vidéo comme celle-ci. Alors j'espère que ça va fonctionner. La raison pour laquelle j'ai décidé de faire cette vidéo et de mettre une vidéo sur Amatis, et c'était parce que en parlant avec des étudiants lundi soir, hein, c'est notre groupe de l'ANSAD, anglais continuant. euh, il y avait des étudiants qui ont dit qu'ils n'ont pas un internet très stable. Alors c'est pour ça qu'il y avait des étudiants effectivement qui venaient chaque cours en présentiel. Euh, mais ces étudiants ont dit que même si internet n'est pas stable, c'était quand même possible de télécharger une vidéo. Bon, elle est sur Amatiste. Alors c'est pour ça que je me suis dit peut-être c'est une meilleure idée de faire comme ça. Alors c'est le premier test. Euh, et comme vous pouvez voir, je vais avoir une vidéo ici et ici à gauche, je vais avoir le worksheet qu'on fait chaque semaine ensemble. Euh, je vais peut-être essayer d'expliquer ou de parler en fait euh, de décrire si on veut le worksheet et aussi je vais lire en anglais l'article et comme ça vous allez avoir ça. Et maintenant aussi sans masque parce que je suis effectivement chez moi, donc il n'y a pas besoin de masque et j'espère pour vous ça va vous aider, comme ça vous pouvez voir ma bouche qui bouge quand je parle en anglais. Ok, du coup je vais passer maintenant en anglais et on va commencer le cours ensemble. Okay, hello everybody. As I was saying, you can see me here on the video without a mask, and to your left there is the worksheet um, that I will explain or describe the worksheet going through it. Normally, I would have asked you if you remembered what we did last week. Obviously, that's quite difficult to do on a recording, so I will maybe do a summary, a résumé of the last two articles and the last topics, themes, or subjects that we dealt with the last 2 weeks. So in the first week, if we remember, we looked at an article written in The Guardian, which is a newspaper mostly to the centre left, still we might call a liberal newspaper. Represents a lot of people mostly from London, so it's kind of London-centric newspaper. The problem or the subject matter of that article was the notion of philosophy or the notion of ideas and their relation, so the relation of ideas to reality, whether it was a good thing or not to have a philosophy, and whether ideas can affect reality. Talking to many of you, we spoke about different ways ideas do have an effect on reality. For example, we spoke about, I think, the abolition of slavery. We spoke about the rise of ideologies in the 20th century. For example, communism and fascism being one as well. The Second World War, and then, which we'll look a bit today, the Cold War, precisely as a way in which ideas had an effect on history and the real world. So the second article that we looked at was an article in particular about Brexit. It was an article written by an author that did not support Brexit, who was, you could say, against Brexit, not in agreement with it. He also argued that the discussion of Brexit being a type of, could call extremist politics, allowed for the emergence of a discussion about ideas in general and different ideas and the way that ideas could affect, again, reality. So at that point, when that second article was written, Brexit still having actually still not necessarily complete, the negotiations are still in place. Again, now, this week we will also look at an article written this time in the Daily Telegraph, this time by someone who is in agreement with Brexit. Before we do that, I would like us to do a kind of warm-up session. And this, I think, also prepares us for the second set of themes that we will pass into next week, that is looking at images and image analysis. So, to begin, as we can see here, this Word document is on this Word document there is a picture of a map. This map is a map of the Imperial Federation, and it is a map of the world showing the extent of the British Empire in 1886. So it is a map which shows how large was the entirety of the British Empire towards the end of the 19th century. I would like to say also that by this time in world history, in British history, the British Empire is actually, one could say, coming to an end, or in the last steps or the last period of its existence, which is important to take into consideration when analysing or when looking at such a map. The warm-up exercise that I would like us to do is a kind of exercise about the spatial description of this map. So, as you can see here, there is a diagram, and on this diagram there are both red, black and red, black and green areas, and then kind of a white area too. And this, I would like us to try and have a look at this vocabulary here. So, in the background, in the foreground, at the top, on top of, next to, underneath, beneath, or under. Although under is not written here, maybe I could put this in here, live. Under. Also at the bottom, on the left, on the right, or on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, in the bottom slash in the top left right corner, or in the top bottom left corner. So this being in the top left corner, top right corner, bottom right corner, bottom left corner. I would also like you to have to think about what their equivalents are in French. So if you could try and think about what these are in French as a kind of first exercise, and an attempt to try and put them in relation to this this box or this diagram. And once you've done that, I would like you then to try and write or describe the the picture, the map at the top. Using this vocabulary and also using the vocabulary that you also know of. And so what I will do is I will pause the video now and give you 5-10 minutes in order to do that. I hope you've managed to have a go at describing the image above. I will give you just a brief description so to give you something to compare your own description to. As you can see in this map, in the background, there is a map of the world. In the center of this map, Britain is placed. From Britain, we see the trading routes, the sea lanes between the other colonies of the British Empire. So we see Canada in red, we see the Caribbean in red, we see South Africa in red, New Zealand and Australia, India, and parts of West Africa as well. We also will see at the bottom of South America, there is also some islands which we will talk about later, which are called the Falkland Islands. I think in French they're called les îles Malouines. So we'll talk about those in a moment. So yeah, we have foreground. We have also a depiction of different people from different colonies in Britain, rather stereotypically depicted. We also have colonizers as well, and soldiers of the British Empire. We also have animals from the different, from seemingly tropical areas. We have, for example, a kangaroo on the bottom right from Australia. On the left, bottom left, we have an elephant from India. In the top, we see, in the border, we have a motto of the British Empire: freedom, fraternity, federation. The one thing I will first say about that is that there was probably not much freedom or fraternity in the British Empire. A federation may be, but a federation of colonies. The freedom, of course, there may be alluding to the freedom of trade more than the freedom of the individuals who were enslaved, or as it is also murdered in the British Empire. There are other things also to talk about. There is in the centre Britannia, who sat on the world holding a trident in the centre to symbolise the power of the British Empire. As many of you might know, I know a student on Monday spoke about this, but what is often understood about the British Empire is it was the empire on which the sun never set. As you can see here, that it englobes the world. Excuse me. So here after the description is, in your opinion, what is the purpose of this map? What are the ideas conveyed? I'd like us to think about this also before we look at the article and its relationship to Brexit. Just to give you a small indication, I think that the purpose of this map is not necessarily a functional map, so to speak. It's not a map that you would use to navigate the seas. It is probably a map to show the power and dominance of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century. Therefore, the ideas, if you will, that are conveyed are the ideas in relation to the power of the British Empire, the dominance of the British Empire. It is certainly a map that is not critical or has a bad opinion of the British Empire. It is a map which is attempting, as a piece maybe of propaganda, to show the dominance and might, the power, the might of the British Empire. There are, of course, many other things that you could say about it, but this would be the first thing. I will stop there now, and the next thing is that we will be reading the article together. Hello. Again, I'm now going to read the article out for you so that you can hear it being read in English. The first thing I'd like to say is this is an article from the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph is a right-wing newspaper concerned with economics and nationalism. It was written on June 21st, 2020, so that it is a newer article in comparison to the one that we read last week. As we will see, this person, as I said earlier, this person is in agreement with Brexit. I'd like us also to think about its parallels to the map we saw earlier and the notion of the British Empire as I go through. There is also a page that I've written of vocabulary, some of the vocabulary that I believe might have been a bit more difficult for you to understand, or the ones which are more idiomatic. I will begin to read it out in paragraph by paragraph, and then I will look at some of the particular more historical references in this article that I think are also useful for understanding it. So I will begin. Daniel Hannan. In the age of global Britain, we must not be squeamish about our national interest. By any measure, Britain is still a great nation. We have to rediscover our self-belief. Britain is defined by its island status, but in precisely the opposite way to that commonly supposed by Europhiles. Insular geography does not make for insular psychology. On the contrary, island nations are unusually dependent on global commerce. Their security rests on open sea lanes and by extension on a rule-based international order. Not having to worry about border disputes with neighbours, they are free to raise their eyes to more distant horizons. As we leave the EU, we need to start thinking seriously about geostrategy. For most of the past half-century, we have tended to subsume our foreign policy interests into broader Western interests. During the Cold War, we were America's adjutant, which means major. The country that reminded more hesitant European allies of their NATO responsibilities. From the 1990s, as the EU began to develop its own foreign policy, we increasingly thought in terms of European rather than British initiatives. There were moments when we did our own thing, the Falklands War being the outstanding example. But British international relations generally operated within NATO and EU parameters, and for understandable reasons. The Second World War had left us bankrupt and exhausted, and we had little choice but to let the United States assume our role, doing our best to hang on to our influences as, in Harold Macmillan's phrase, Greeks to their Romans. In the 4 decades before 1989, defending Western Europe from Soviet expansionism was a direct and immediate British interest. In the sweep of history, though, those were exceptional decades. The peculiar circumstances of the Cold War and then our anomalous membership of the EU left us thinking like a continental rather than a maritime nation. We neglected those countries which, though close to us in every other sense, were distant physically. The neglect is now at an end. This week, Britain announced the formal opening of its trade talks with Australia and New Zealand. Their prime ministers released videos that fizzed with excitement. I might try and do an Australian accent here. My friend Boris Johnson and I will not settle for anything less than an ambitious and high-quality deal that benefits both our nations, beamed Australia's Scott Morrison, promising to get the deal concluded by the beginning of the next year. The tone could hardly contrast more sharply with the sulkiness we hear from Eurocrats. Freed from the constraints of EU membership, Britain is springing back to the Anglosphere. When, to pluck a recent example, China threatened to snuff out the independence of Hong Kong, a joint condemnation was issued by the American, Australian, British and Canadian governments. The EU was invited to join in, but declined. Britain should, of course, aim to have the closest possible friendship with Europe. But friendship is a two-way street. As long as the EU, if not its constituent nations, insists on treating Britain as some kind of secessionist province, our relationship is bound to be awkward. Charles de Gaulle astutely observed that Britain could never be a properly European country because it felt the pull of the ocean, le grand large, as he always called it, the open main. Such a country will, in general, want a strong navy rather than a large army. It will want to remove trade barriers. It will want to support small, independent states. The sympathy of England with the freedom and independence of nationalities is of ancient origin, said Randolph Churchill in 1886, same time as the map was drawn, and has become the traditional direction of our foreign policy. He was right, just as Britain had sponsored national movements in Italy, Greece, the Low Countries and South America. So it was to go on after Lord Randolph's time, to join two terrible wars, not because it had been attacked, but because the sovereignty of a smaller state had been violated. There is a reference to Poland. Britain's inclination of free trade will align it naturally with Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and other Commonwealth allies. Protectionist tendencies are on the rise in Beijing, Brussels, and even Washington. It will fall to us, as we resume our vote and our voice at the World Trade Organization, to drive the process which, more than any other, raises nations from the lowest barbarism to the highest populism. The first step, though, in unashamedly recognizing that there are such things as British national interests. The folding of the Department for International Development into the Foreign Office is an important step. Like all ministries, DFID has its blob, its nexus of officials, quangocrats, charity bosses and lobbyists who like to pursue their own policy regardless of the wishes of elected ministers. It is worth standing back and asking why states give aid at all, rather than leaving the whole business to voluntary groups. The answer, surely, is that development assistance is a tool of foreign policy. Other countries acknowledge this much more readily than our aid professionals do. What goes for trade and aid goes for anything else. We should identify and promote our specific interests, even when they differ from those of friendly nations. We should do so with hard and soft power, from the RAF to the British Council. In a world where others integrate propaganda, cybersecurity, espionage, and, where necessary, actual force, we cannot stand squeamishly above the fray. It has become a commonplace to say that Britain has delusions of grandeur, that it refuses to come to terms with its diminished status. If anything, the reverse is true. We are, by any measure, one of the world's top 5 powers. We have the best legal and financial services, the most professional armed forces. We are one of 8 nuclear states and one of 5 UN Security Council members. We are home to the global language in the world's capital city. No comparable nation moans about its decline. The disorder on our streets these past 2 weeks, the attacks on statues, the claims that Britain had an especially shameful past, served to demoralise and demotivate. A nation that lacks self-belief is lost. Remember what nation it is whereof ye are, Milton told the MPs of his own day. We are the country that developed and exported the sublime idea that laws should not be passed, nor taxes raised, except by elected representatives. We taught the world the rule of law. We were not just early in ending slavery, we were unique in pouring resources into stamping it out globally. We defeated the Nazi and Soviet tyrannies and liberated hundreds of millions of people. Ours is a stirring and ancient song, and it is not yet sung. The first thing I would like to say about this article is that these opinions are of the author. They are not my own opinions. There are many problematic things which are being said in this article, in my opinion, things which are borderline racist. The idea, for example, that the World Trade Organization raises nations from the lowest barbarism to the highest populism is a trope, an old idea that those countries which do not partake of global commerce are barbarous and therefore are not opulent or rich because of their ancient or old non-modern ways. This is, of course, a racist idea. As we can see also that the article is a nationalist article. It is an article that is arguing that Britain remains strong and dominant in the world. I would, lastly actually on this, I think that the last paragraph is particularly problematic. It is arguing that we the Britons taught the world the rule of law, therefore that somehow colonialism or the British Empire was justified in its violence by bringing law to these countries. The idea, of course, that there was no idea of law or no order prior to the British Empire, which is, of course, a lie. The other thing as well here is we could say the kind of irony, kind of disgusting irony actually, behind the idea of teaching the world the rule of law, at the same time ending slavery. Of course, the British Empire enslaved huge swathes of the world. So we can see this kind of contradiction or distinction of this kind of pride of the empire next to the idea of the pride of ending slavery. Of course, one being a kind of pride in slavery and the one being a pride in abolishing slavery, which I think is rather contradictory. Also, the idea that somehow Britain defeated the Nazi and Soviet tyrannies. We could also understand the British Empire as a tyranny. Of course, it invaded and imposed its law. And the imposition of law is a tyrannical trait. This is the vocab that I think may be difficult. I will upload this as a separate document so that you have this next to it. You might also be able to to go back and forwards to this vocabulary. What I will do now is ask these questions, and I will then leave you again to have a look at these. So, number one, what is the author's opinion on Britain's geography? In his opinion, how does it define its identity? So how is Britain formed, or how is Britain's identity, according to the author, formed by its position, its geography as an island? Number two, according to Hanan, is British foreign policy efficient? List the events from the past that have influenced it in the present direction. So the question is asking, how has foreign policy, how has the wars and economic agreements that it has entered into affected its direction, affected Britain as a country? And is this a good thing for the author? Number 3. How is Brexit depicted by the author? How is it supposed to change Britain's role in global politics and trade? So how, in distinction to number 2, how is Brexit now seen as, in a sense, beneficial to the author in relation to politics and trade? Number 4, is Britain described as a diminished country by Hanan? How does he use the past to justify his description? Here also, I would like us to also look at the present. How is he describing Britain currently as well? So number 5, compare the ideas conveyed in the Imperial Federation map, so the map above. So this map. Compare this map and the ideas that we spoke about here with the way that this article is written. Do you identify similarities between the two? Thank you.